and then share the PowerPoint. All right. This is a time period that I basically lived, so I know something firsthand about it. When I was growing up, the institutional controversy was in full bloom, and I heard a lot of sermons on biblical authority and the work, worship, and organizational structure of the church when I was growing up. And I think we've gotten away from that to a degree and would urge younger preachers to get back to preaching basic truths. I'll keep this talk short, both because it's Thanksgiving week and also because of my surgery and still getting used to the idea of talking. I've got this reconstructed gum work that doesn't feel quite right yet, so we'll see. But in any case, the institutional controversy, mid 20th century, this is something that was brewing probably a little bit earlier in the 20th century. Certainly, it was in people's minds by the 40s, and there were isolated incidents of it all throughout the beginning of the 20th century. But it really took off in the 50s and then became downright divisive by the late 50s, early 60s. And then by the time I was really growing up in the late 60s and 70s, you were sweeping up the remnants of it. And institutional churches as a whole were fighting for their lives in many cases, if not most. Members of mainstream churches who had non-institutional convictions had to leave and start over. And so there were a lot of non-institutional churches that started from scratch during this time. Preachers had to get by on meager salaries or do something else for a living and preach on the side. And for the most part, it was a very tough time for those who I believe held the truth, because we were in the minority and we were simply trying to survive. And we were going through all of this and being blasted by our institutional brethren who were bound and determined to have their projects one way or another, even at the expense of losing fellowship with the rest of us. But in any case, as the 20th century progressed, you have during the World War II period and afterwards, the churches of Christ boomed. They were growing like wildfire. And yet, with this massive growth came new challenges, new ways of thinking, very similar to the massive growth that led to the mid to late 19th century divisions. Different kind of mindset grew up with the second, third generation of those who had rebuilt in times past. And so these are quotes of others, in many cases institutional people. As Richard Hughes has said, many churches of Christ deliberately sought acculturation into the mainstream of American life. They no longer wanted to be what Robert Hoover calls religious outsiders, or what Ed Harold dubs the spirited offspring of the religious rednecks of the postbellum South. They wanted mainstream respectability. Less separation, more respectability, rising tide of denominational pride. Even though they didn't want to use the denominational language, the churches of Christ in the main were rapidly becoming a surrogate denomination. Ruel Lemon celebrated that the church is no longer smothered in insignificance. That tells you, that speaks volumes, doesn't it? Pepperdine University came out of what George Pepperdine started in downtown LA. Religion, Ed Harrell used to say Watts, which is one of the toughest neighborhoods of LA. But because of some donors, gained some property in Malibu and became a very wealthy, respectable institution. N.B. Hardeman, highly respected preacher and walking horse breeder in the Nashville area. His tabernacle sermons at Ryman Auditorium, where the Grand Ole Opry also took place, announced to the whole South that the Churches of Christ had arrived. In 1959, his friends honored him with a banquet that included Governor Buford Ellington, Senator Albert Gore Sr., and Senator Lyndon Johnson from Texas. He would be the future Vice President and President of the United States. Annual college lectureships grew in status and popularity. They showcased the new college-trained preachers who often had a disdain for the rough around the edges preachers of the previous generation. A growing commercialized professionalism existed among them. And as Ed Harrell has said, the lectureships themselves came to be surrogate denominational conventions. As far as the issues themselves that came to a head in the 1950s, the sponsoring church was one of the two. The other was support of human institutions. So those two issues became the two showcase issues front and center. Do churches have a right to support colleges, orphan homes, other human institutions to do the work of the Lord through those institutions? Or can one coordinating, sponsoring church accept the funds of many churches and funnel those funds and hence the work of many churches through one parent church or sponsoring church that will in turn supervise and dispense the work? Those were the two keynote issues. Centralization of work under the Churches of Christ brand name was basically a copycat of what was going on a wide scale among the denominations. And brethren began to speak of our schools, our papers, our preachers, our brotherhood projects, as if the Churches of Christ were just another denomination, even though they declined to use the denominational nomenclature per se and attach it to Churches of Christ, but they were using a lot of other language that denominations use. You have your Baptist preachers, your Presbyterian preachers, and your Church of Christ preachers. Your Baptist papers, your Presbyterian papers, and your Church of Christ papers. Your Baptist schools, your Baptist or your Methodist schools, and your Church of Christ schools. And they began thinking in those terms. Not a denomination, or is it? Sponsoring churches in 1943, G.C. Brewer announced that the Broadway Church of Christ in Lubbock, Texas would sponsor the evangelization of post-war Europe. Many churches would funnel their funds through Broadway, which would in turn supervise the work. In 1946, speakers at a Broadway lectureship called for more centralization of church work. By the end of 1946, the rush toward concentrating funds in the hands of large congregations to sponsor missions had become a stampede, in Ed Harrell's words. Prior to mid-century, there were limited cooperative ventures with sponsoring churches, no question. So a lot of institutional brethren will cite the fact that you do have some of these instances before the 1950s. And they are right about that. But they were limited, and they tended not to be national campaigns by any stretch of the imagination. And there was also opposition to them. As O.C. Lambert said way back in 1936, if the Lord had intended that his work be done on a bigger scale than can be handled by the local church, he would have designed a bigger organization. Support of colleges. In 1946, N.B. Hardeman of Tabernacle Sermon fame, Ryman Auditorium, he wrote a series of articles urging church support for schools run by brethren. W.W. Odie urged administrators, for the sake of peace and unity, to keep the support of their schools out of the Lord's treasury. So already the battles were heating up. The debate quickly reached an impasse. There were new journalistic lows, new invective. In fact, this got, quite dirty. People got down into the mud and got to name calling on both sides. In 1940, G.C. Brewer referred to conservatives as a cantankerous crowd of hysterical and schismatic preachers. The papers, magazines run by brethren became battlegrounds of invective language. Non-institutional brothers were derisively labeled antis. Supporters were labeled liberals. And the institutional controversy, the battle lines began to be drawn. Early 1950s. N.B. Hardeman, G.C. Brewer, B.C. Goodpasture, Guy N. Woods, Ruel Lemons, James Bales, Thomas Warren, G.K. Wallace are some of the more aggressive or well-known names attached to support for institutionalism. Boy E. Wallace Jr. was initially against this, and then when he saw that the tide was turning for it, changed his views on it. I won't impute him for his motives, but he did change his views, became an outspoken supporter. The Gospel Advocate, Firm Foundation were pro-institutional papers. Detractors included Yater Tant, Roy Cogdill, Homer Haley, James Cope, John T. Lewis in Birmingham, James Adams in Texas, Robert Turner, W. Curtis Porter, James P. Miller in Florida, Lloyd Moyer out here in California, Cecil Douthat. The Gospel Guardian and Preceptor were anti-papers, if you will. The Herald of Truth became a lightning rod of pro-institutional support. The Fifth and Highland Church in Abilene, Texas began to broadcast the Herald of Truth in 1952. Initially a radio program, later a television program, supported by many congregations through the sponsoring church arrangement. It further boosted the image of Churches of Christ, and that was part of the whole plea for advertising. Became a symbol of the institutional controversy. B.C. Goodpasture initiated a quarantine of the antis in the Gospel Advocate. He had finally had enough. And so in the 1950s, his Gospel Advocate tried to limit the influence of non-institutional preachers. If you rig the rules of the game and engage in the right kind of censorship, put a target on the backs of those who do not agree with you and don't go along for the ride, then you can, especially if you're in the majority, then you can play those kinds of power politic games. In 1954, the idea of a quarantine was published. You talk to some of the older non-institutional preachers that are still alive, that lived through that period, they still have some bitterness about that. still speak of that quarantine. A deluge of confessions was published of preachers who renounced antiism and converted over to the glorious mainstream of denominational pride. Preachers who refused to line up were intimidated, often fired. Most faithful non-institutional preachers have some story about being fired during this period. And many of them were censured and otherwise limited from their former influence. Mainstream institutional churches jumped on the bandwagon full hog, full force, full of new pride with big projects, institutional machinery. They were proud about being something bigger than the local congregation, being part of that. As Richard Hughes, who is pro-institutional, has said, put another way, the Church of Christ had instead become a full-blown denomination. Not my words, his. But nonetheless, I think he's accurate about that. Non-institutional brothers often had to start over. Beginning in the 1960s, and this is Ed Harrell, and I think this is correct. It's certainly true of my father, his brothers, who were preachers during this period. Beginning in the 1960s, most members, and I want you to digest this statement because it's important. Most members of non-institutional churches of Christ began to refocus on building new congregations. More often than not, leaving the local churches they had attended for many years to begin from scratch. You think about that and process that. We can become critical about all the name calling and about all the mudslinging and the fighting. But this was a very, very tough time for anyone who stood for the truth, in my opinion. As far as what the New Testament teaches, local church organization, local elders in every local church, and on the universal level, you don't have any kind of organizational, bureaucratic institution on the earth. You simply have a fellowship of individual believers all over the earth with Jesus as the only head in heaven. No denominations, no bureaucracies, no parachurch organizations, no federations of churches, no denominational structures. So you have a Church of Christ denomination that pretends not to be a denomination, is essentially what is happening. In the New Testament, you have independent churches, all of whom are amenable and accountable to Jesus Christ. In Revelation 2 and 3, each church is judged on its own merits. Each church stands or falls on its own. But this is what you begin to see in the 1950s, a little bit earlier, but full-blown way in the 1950s, with a concept of our schools, our papers, our preachers, our brotherhood, our agencies, our sponsoring churches, and so on. And it became a situation where churches of Christ in the mainstream were very much copying denominations in this organizational machinery. In the New Testament, congregations worked concurrently toward the same goal. There were no bureaucratic or organizational superstructures, no federations of churches. Big bureaucracies are not always best. Support of preachers was direct. So many churches supported Paul to preach in Corinth. No other church supported Paul other than the Philippians at one point. No other church but you alone, he says in Philippians 4. And when there was benevolence that involved intercongregational needs, you have two major cases, one in which church in Antioch supported brethren in Judea who were beset by famine in Acts 11. There were several churches in Judea, or you have several churches helping the Jerusalem church a little bit later on. 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, Romans 15, etc. But notice the direct relationship involved. Observation number one, this is critically important. If you don't get this point in light of your study of the New Testament pattern, then you will miss the essence of what I'm trying to argue here. The only time funds were transferred from one church to another church is when the receiving church, through circumstances beyond its control, developed a need it could not handle. And I think that is so important. Through circumstances beyond its control. It wasn't a situation where one church decided to take on the work of the universal church voluntarily and willingly. No, it was through circumstances beyond its control when it developed a benevolent situation that swamped it and could not even meet its own need. Then you have direct sending of funds from one church to another church. Observation number two, church support of evangelists was direct, not funneled through an intermediary agency, either by way of a human organization or even a coordinating church. So you could view this as the American Christian Missionary Society in the 1849 year and following. Or you could look at it as an orphan's home, a college, a world broadcasting network, or a host of other agencies that pop up in the 20th century. You don't have that indirect human intermediary taking on the work of congregations. Nor do you have a centralizing or sponsoring church taking on the work of many congregations. So again, simple matter of authority in the biblical blueprint. I believe wholeheartedly that the non-institutional brethren were right on this. I still believe that. And the problem is they or we could not get involved in projects in a supportive way and participate in that sort of thing. And therefore, if churches were going to go whole hog with that and go full throttle, then a rupture fellowship was inevitable. So a few questions to ponder, and then I'll leave the class with you to think about. Questions related to institutionalism led to congregations dividing and brethren going their separate ways in the 50s and 60s. Just as in the Missionary Society and Instrumental Music Division a century earlier. Yet, did the rift have more to do with the issue per se, or about underlying attitudes about the nature of the church and the authority of Scripture? I really believe that the latter is true, that the issue was an outlet that enabled people who had basically changed their view of Scripture and their view of the DNA of the church to have an outlet for changing the whole way church is done. Another way of stating that is, was the issue simply a matter of sending a few dollars to a good cause, or was there a bigger issue at stake? I've always taken issue with the idea that this is only this is a petty issue. It only involves sending a few dollars here or a few dollars there. I think that totally misses the whole point of what's at stake here. What's at stake is the authority of the New Testament blueprint and the nature of the New Testament church. And to say that this issue revolves around just sending a few dollars to some organization, I think totally misses the whole issue. Initially, there was much debating about what the Bible authorized, with one side stretching the biblical evidence and castigating naysayers as cantankerous and opponents of progress. Sometimes the accusations got ugly. You all are nothing but widows and orphan haters. You don't care about reaching the lost. You don't believe in cooperating with other brethren. None of which was true. None of which. And none of which was necessary. But when you are crafting a narrative and you're absolutely bound and determined to go full throttle, that's sometimes what people will do, is try to pigeonhole the opponents and to mischaracterize them. Wise observers have pointed out that in Restoration history, brothers and sisters of widely different personal convictions are usually able to maintain peace and unity. Divisions tend to be localized and not widespread, unless there's a larger issue at stake, usually one that involves differences over biblical authority. And this was true of the institutional controversy, which is why widespread differences led to widespread division. Because the issue was not individuality of conscience. The issue is, we're either going to do this or we're not, as a collective whole, and involving what the New Testament blueprint actually was. So I think division ultimately was unavoidable, just as it was with the instrumental music question and the missionary society question. One other point that I'll mention, I've heard from a number of older brethren when I was younger, that in fact the point used to be made quite often when I was a kid, that had there been more preaching in the early 20th century against the missionary society, there would have been more opposition to institutionalism. But a lot of the preaching on the issues of the 1800s was limited to instrumental music. And in these brethren's opinion, the missionary society did not get the coverage that it deserved. And therefore, when the institutional controversy hit, you have a lot of parallels to the missionary society, but many brethren were unaccustomed to dealing with it. So I'll just throw that one out for free. I think that's probably a fair observation. All right. That's going to be it, unless there are questions or comments. In the books that I'm having you read, I'm sure there'll be more fodder for discussion, which we can do later on. But this just kind of introduces you to the big issue in the mid 20th century, toward the end of the 20th century. There were other issues that popped up toward the late 20th century. We'll deal with some of those next time. But that was the huge issue of consequence in Churches of Christ in the 50s, 60s, and beyond. Okay. Any questions, comments?
Yeah. Do you think that this whole question of churches getting together, do you think it's why a lot of churches that we would consider faithful don't really talk to each other or know what's going on with each
Yeah,
other?
I think that what often happens is you fight one extreme and you end up going too far to the other extreme. And the idea that we're not bound in some sort of larger organizational superstructure does not mean that we shouldn't talk with each other, encourage one another, and cooperate in scriptural ways, including sharing of preachers and supporting indirectly each other's efforts through, when one church has a gospel meeting, members of another church will help that work out by supporting that meeting with their attendance, prayers, and so on. And it's true, each church is local, autonomous, and independent organizationally, but it ought not to be true that we avoid each other like the plague simply to remain autonomous and independent. And I think that's a fair observation.
Yeah, I think that, and it kind of goes along with what Richard Hughes says in his book, is he puts a lot of emphasis on the Church of Christ kind of just acts like another denomination in the language that people that go to the Church of Christ use. And I do see some validity to that sometimes. I can argue all day long that, the Church of Christ it's universal. That's like why we call it that. But then there are just times where you use very we versus them centered language and some of the things that we say. And I think that's definitely a problem because we kind of build in almost a denominational mindset. And, for someone like me who grew up going to a Church of Christ, there are semblances of that are just kind of ingrained within you based on the way that people talk. So.
I think that's absolutely correct. And something to work on in your preaching is to foster an undenominational mindset about what the church universal really is. And one guy that could help you immensely with that is Robert Turner. He was probably had one of the healthiest attitudes about getting away from this whole denominational mindset of anyone in that generation. Highly influenced me, highly influenced even older men like Paul Earnhardt, and really taught against the corporate mentality of where we are going, where we are headed, as if we're part of something larger than the local church and smaller than the universal church. And really inculcated, I think, the right kind of thinking. The other, obviously you could do your own study on that in the New Testament, but another guy that really thought a lot in those terms was F.D. Shrigley in his book, The New Testament Church, which is a series of articles he did in the 1890s in Gospel Advocate. If people had really studied what he had to say, I think they never would have gotten into the we and the us mentality. And I would highly recommend both Robert Turner's writings and F.D. Shrigley's writings in that regard. And you could work a lot of that into your preaching and your own study of the New Testament. Remind me, and we'll have some shop talk powwows on that. Okay, I'm going to let you go for today. I'll see you all tomorrow morning, and you have a good rest of your afternoon and evening. Take care.
Thank you.